My name is Eunice, and I'm the founder of the Africa Technology Business Network. And we're a community of entrepreneurs who are creating solutions to drive Africa forward using technology and innovation. What I'd like to share with you tonight is my journey to setting up the Africa Technology Business Network, or ATBN. And I'll share 3 key turning points I've had along the way, which I'll refer to as the 3 shutterings. These were times in my life when my confidence and my self-belief were tested, but which also taught me how challenging situations can create the building blocks for our dreams. These 3 shatterings take place, the first one in Uganda, which is where I'm from. Any Ugandans or East Africans in the house? Woo, yeah! The second one takes place in Italy, which is where I did my master's, and the third one here in the UK. I'll start in Uganda. In 2009, myself and 2 friends set up a tech venture called EastAfricaTenders.com. And our idea was very simple. We took the tenders that were advertised in the newspapers every week across 4 East African countries, that's Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda, and we posted digital versions of them in an online database. I got the idea for this while working as an intern at a local management consultancy firm. And one of my roles as an intern was to look through the papers for bids and tenders that were relevant for our firm. I would search through piles of newspapers, sometimes hundreds of tenders, and usually only found about a handful that were relevant. I thought it was time-consuming and wasteful. About a year later, I teamed up with Simon, a talented software developer, and Jeffrey, a procurement specialist, and we set out to create a solution. And we did, and it was great. You could search for tenders by industry, you could subscribe to tenders from a specific sector, and you could even receive custom email alerts when a tender that you were interested in had its deadline approaching and was about to expire. So I very excitedly went about selling my solution to local businesses in Uganda, and they weren't interested. They thought the idea was interesting, but they weren't willing to pay for it because buying the newspapers wasn't an issue for them. They bought them anyway for the news. It also turned out that, unlike me who hated it, some guys whose job it was to look through the papers for tenders quite liked having the excuse to read the paper every morning. And the one willing to introduce me to their bosses once I told them about my solution. What we did find, however, was that we got a lot of interest from abroad. So I had people emailing me from India, China, Pakistan, and other African countries because they were interested in bidding for some of those big government contracts that were advertised in the newspapers, and they could not get their hands on the newspapers. So like any entrepreneur, I needed to figure out how to get paid. PayPal seemed like the obvious choice, but it turned out that while I could make payments, I could not receive or withdraw payments via PayPal in Uganda. And I remember reading the statement on PayPal's website, saying this service, is not available in our territory, and wondering, why not? And then thinking, well, how else am I supposed to receive payments? Because these clients weren't willing to go through the hassle and expense of making an international bank transfer just to pay a $10 a month subscription to a website. And so there I was. I poured blood, sweat, tears, not to mention my savings, into building this platform. It worked, and we even had clients who were willing to pay us, and we could not receive payments. This was the first shattering. Because until then, I was really confident. I had big, big dreams. I thought I was going to be this, big tech entrepreneur. I thought I was going to revolutionize the tender discovery industry in East Africa, and then, watch out, Mark Zuckerberg. And this situation made me realize that there was a limit to my dream. And that limit was not based on how great my idea was, or how hard I worked. It was simply based on where I lived in the world. And this somehow made me feel small and insignificant. And even worse, it made me feel like Uganda, which is where I'd lived my entire life until this point, was also somehow small and insignificant. So insignificant, PayPal didn't even work there. Our business didn't really gain traction, and I started looking for opportunities to study abroad. I guess I wanted to see this rest of the world where PayPal worked. A few months later, I got the opportunity to do a 2-year master's in Italy. It was the first time in my life I left East Africa. I was 25 years old, and it was the first time I got on a plane. I arrived in Italy, and there, like one of my favorite writers, Chimamanda Adichie, describes through her character Ifemelu, I discover I'm African. Now that may sound strange. Did I not know I was African this whole time? But you see, until this point, my understanding of my identity was in the following order. So first I was, well, me, Eunice Baguma, and then I was daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Timothy Baguma. And then after that, I was defined by the fact that I was a city girl. So I grew up in Kampala, which is quite mixed, and probably didn't speak my local language as well as I should. And then after that, I was defined by the fact that I'm a Mutoro, which is a tribe from the western part of Uganda. A fact for which I could be identified both from my skin tone and also, very sadly, from my height. And then after all of that, I was Ugandan. The only time I remember us as Ugandans identifying as African was when it was either the World Cup or the Olympics and Uganda was not represented, which sadly was majority of the time. But which is when we basically picked the African country we thought had the best chances of making it farthest in the competition. And we rooted for them, and then it was like, you know, we're all like, go Africa. Those were the only times I remembered really ever thinking of myself as African. So now I'm in Italy and I'm African. I also discover that this is not exactly a desirable or enviable thing to be. I remember a particular incident on a train. I was traveling with some friends, and this woman starts to shout very angrily all sorts of nasty things at us, including, "Go back to Africa." Now, I always think back to that incident and wonder why it affected me the way it did. And I realized, having grown up in Uganda, there was nothing in my life until that point that had prepared me for such an encounter. And I also think the fact that this woman was quite an older woman. And you know, growing up in Uganda, and it's the same in many other parts of Africa, there's a strong emphasis on respecting elders and seeing them as wiser. And so I think this caused me somehow to give credence to her words. And I started to think, maybe she's right. Maybe I have no right to be here. See, this is the scariest thing about negative stereotypes, is that you can start to internalize them and you can start to believe them yourself. This was a second shuttering. I started to feel embarrassed I was African. I remember at some time contemplating, you know, putting on an American accent and pretending I was Black American. I might have done at a party a time or two. I would still be Black, so I'd still have some issues. But at least I wouldn't be African. For the rest of my stay in Italy, I had to go through this process of really defining my identity for myself. Away from family and friends and all these things that I'd known to define me, I had to really figure out the things that I believed and who I was. And I emerged from this process stronger, wiser, confident. After completing my master's, I moved back to Uganda, where I worked for a local software development company. I also got married to a lovely English boy, Mr. Nigel Ball, who is in the house today. He lived in Uganda for 5 years, and we'd met before I left for Italy. And we'd somehow survived the perils of a long-distance relationship, first when I was in Italy, and then later when he moved back home to the UK. In 2013, 4 years after we'd met, we got married. I quit my job in Uganda and moved to London to join him. So now you remember where we were in the story, stronger, wiser, confident, remember that? Yeah, London managed to shatter that. So the third shattering, here we go again. It was job application after job application, sometimes interviews, mostly rejection. I wanted to work in tech. And even though I'd worked in tech for over 5 years, including running my own startup, it was in Uganda, which here is not exactly well known for its technology sector. I also discovered that even among British women here, there was this campaign to change the ratio because women are underrepresented in the tech industry. And so here I was, a woman, and foreign, because now the new label was foreign. And I wanted to work in tech. Now, when I think back to some of the jobs that I applied for when I'd just arrived, I sometimes laugh. Because suffice to say, I was being pretty ambitious. See, I was confident in my abilities, but I hadn't realized how the job market here would view me. I soon realized it, though, and my confidence plummeted. Now, some of the best advice I got during that period was from my incredible husband, who said to me, "Don't underestimate what you know. It makes you different. And in super competitive London, different can be a good thing." So I started to think about, what do I know? And most importantly, what am I passionate about? And for me, the answer to that was technology, especially technology in Africa, where it's truly transforming lives. And so while networking within the London tech scene, I started talking to people about the fact that I worked in technology in Africa. And I found that a lot of people were not aware about the rising tech scene in Africa, tech hubs that have sprung up across the continent, and entrepreneurs like I was who are creating innovative solutions and building startups. I also found that people were quite interested in what I had to say. And just realizing that I had this knowledge that was not common to everybody and that people were interested boosted my confidence. I also started to seek out roles that capitalized on that experience. And soon enough, I got my first job offer, working for a technology company that was looking to expand into Africa. Now, in my new role, it involved me going to a lot of doing business in Africa events. Now, some of you might have been to some of these. They usually go something like this. We started out talking about the opportunities in Africa. So 7 out of 10 of the fastest growing economies in the world. GDP rates will be quoted, and we'll all get fired up. And then inevitably, the conversation turned to the challenges. There was always that guy in the room who put up his hand and asked a question about corruption. And then inevitably, the conversation turned to the challenges and corruption and lack of electricity, lack of infrastructure, governance. And then we'd leave and we'd go to the next doing business in Africa event. And I don't know about you, but I usually left those events thinking, well, now what? What next? And I started thinking about creating this network where we talked about opportunities because opportunities are there and they're immense. And yes, we talked about the challenges because they're real, but where we focus the conversation on solutions, on creating solutions to the challenges to unlock the opportunities. And after thinking about this for a number of weeks, I went online on Meetup and I created a Meetup group called the Africa Technology Business Network. And I remember I posted up the very first event and then later agonizing that nobody was going to turn up. I'd been in the UK less than a year and I didn't really know anybody. And my husband said to me, well, if 5 people turn up, at least you'd have made 5 friends. 8 months later, we're a community of over 450 members, and we've held 6 events. In September, we'll be launching a tech accelerator for Africa-focused solutions called Fast Forward Africa. I've had the privilege of interacting with some truly inspiring and talented entrepreneurs through the network. In April, we held a tech pitch event, Africa Tech Pitch, and one of the entrepreneurs who pitched was a bold, ambitious entrepreneur. He's one of the co-founders of VoguePay, a startup who, in their own words, are trying to create PayPal for Africa. It was such a great moment for me and such a privilege to be able to, in some way, support a startup that was trying to create a solution to something that I had felt so personally myself as an entrepreneur in Uganda, trying to fulfill my dream. I've met Pius, a passionate entrepreneur who's setting up Uhuru TV, a platform aimed at empowering Africans at the grassroots to tell their own stories to a global audience and help change the negative narrative of Africa in the media. I've met Dumebi, a talented data analyst who's creating EasyFin, a unique credit scoring system for the unbanked in Africa to enable them access credit. And these are just a few examples of the inspiring and talented entrepreneurs I've had the privilege of interacting with. Each one of these entrepreneurs is harnessing their energy, their skills, and their talent and passion to moving Africa forward. And each one of them has their own story, has challenges they've had to overcome along the way. Because you see, just as with many other resources, harnessing ourselves sometimes involves digging below the surface. And that's what challenging situations, like my 3 shutterings, do. They force us to dig deeper within ourselves. So I don't know what your story is here tonight, but maybe you have a vision, an idea, something that you want to do to change the world around you. But maybe, just like me, you've had some shutterings along the way. Thank God for those situations, because the pieces that they create are the very building blocks for your dream. So pick up the pieces and start building. Thank you very much.